The year was 2020. One of my best friends came over with his Xbox with a game for me to play. What Remains of Edith Finch. The title sounded kinda spooky, and when we got to the forest to go to the house in the game, I was almost certain that it was going to be a horror game. And in a way, I'm kind of right, because this game is about the horrible and early deaths of every Finch family member. After finishing the game that night, I knew that this was going to be one of my favorite games. Now, I know that Game Theory just recently made a video about this game, and MatPat honestly found so many things I've overlooked while playing this game. For example, Great-Grandma Edie lived to be 93, while her father, the second longest living family member, died in his 50s. I was completely missed that she, in fact, is the longest living Finch. And the fact that Molly did eat the things that would make her sick the night she died, but none of them in a lethal amount, I never noticed that. Mostly because I didn't take the time to look into it. I just kind of assumed the stuff is poisonous, so that is why she died. But now I'm going to go ahead and say my theory for this game. I don't think Edie murdered her kids either intentionally or unintentionally, but I do believe that every story that we read is fabricated by her. And because of neglectful parenting, this family has lost a lot of people that could have easily been saved had their parents been more observant. But I also think Edie can't help it. I think Edie is a pathological liar and believes that these stories are as true as the others believe once the ideas enter her head. So, welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. This is actually a game that has been one of my favorites for years, but I never thought to make a theory video about it. Mainly because at first glance, the deaths of all the family members seem pretty straightforward for the most part. Molly gets poisoned, Calvin falls down a cliff, baby Gregory falls and drowns in the bathtub, and Walter is hit by a train. The only huge mysteries were Barbara, the child actor who seemingly was eaten by monsters, and Milton, who disappeared. But everything else, again, seemed pretty straightforward, until you really start to analyze each story. So, that's what we're going to do today. We will be walking through each family death, the true story, and why we were given these fake stories. Just a quick trigger warning before we start. There's going to be a lot of child deaths in this game. We're going to talk about sexual assault and suicide as well. So if any of these kinds of topics are something that you are sensitive to, please click off this video and maybe check out some of my other theories. I have a playlist of all my game theories on my channel if you want to check them out. For those of you who are still around, let's begin with a brief overview of the Finch household. The Finches, specifically Edie, throughout the years have seemed to have an obsession with death. They immortalize every person by refusing to take anything out of anyone's bedroom and instead leaves the room like a time capsule as a remembrance of each night the member died and just build new parts of the house for any additional members that come. People are encouraged to go in the rooms until Edith's mom seals all the doors the night her and Edith leave the house, but as Edith says, Great-Grandma Edie retaliated by putting in peepholes. So Edie definitely still wants people to see these rooms. This house is like a museum of deaths of the family, and looming over it all is a continuous talk of a family curse. But is it really a curse? Or is it just bad parenting? Edie does some really sketchy stuff throughout her life that makes me feel like this family is hiding a much bigger secret than a curse. I think Edie knows she's responsible for the deaths of all her family members in one way or another. And to cover it up, she's the one who places the notes in the diaries to tell the story of the curse. Because if you think about it, how could every family member be able to document their death or conveniently have the ability for someone in the family to capture every single family death? The kids can't confirm any of this is not true. The oldest, Molly, died when Barbara was only 3. Calvin and Sam were born 3 years later, and Walter was born 5 years later. None of them would know any better. If Mom says it's a curse, it's a curse. So my theory is that every story we read about this family is just that, a story, a fabrication of what really happened. No more reliable than the comic book in Barbara's room. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at some of the deaths in the order that they are presented, starting with Molly. The story that we're given of Molly is an interesting start. She's sent to bed without any supper, presumably for doing something wrong, and this is her punishment. As a result, she begins eating all kinds of things that she finds in her room, including an old carrot from a gerbil cage, holly berries, and a whole tube of toothpaste. She then sees a bird and is suddenly transformed into a cat. As the player, we are now hopping from branch to branch to get this bird. After one final leap, we are transformed into an owl, hunting rabbits. Then, we're turned into a shark. We roll down the hill into an ocean and are now looking for seals, becoming more and more hungry with each animal we become. And finally, we become a large tentacle monster. We find ourselves in a boat devouring sailors. We eventually travel through a sewage drain and end up in Molly's bathroom and go hide under her bed. The passage ends with Molly terrified that she is definitely going to be the next victim to this monster. The conclusion most people make is Molly poisoned herself, hallucinated all these things happening, and ended up passing away in her sleep. But, again, the poisoning doesn't really make any sense now with the proportions of the items in mind. At most, it would make her just incredibly sick. You know when people who are pathological liars will tell a story about someone being sick or passing away or something similar, and there's just something off about it? Scientifically impossible, but just barely? Or a 1 in a million chance of something happening, and it just happens to do so perfectly in their situation multiple times? This is how this story feels. And also, I don't think anyone has taken into account that Molly is 10 years old at the time of her death. What 10-year-old expecting to be dead in the morning would be writing all of this down? How would she even be writing this down if she's hallucinating? If she is super sick, we'd see distortion in the writing, scribbles, extra lines, but no, the writing is clean and neat. She is skipping lines, but in a pattern, more so for paragraphs, and it's still all orderly. You'll even notice that the page before this entry is completely blank. It also seems to be near the beginning of this diary. Look how thin the beginning of the journal is from the point that we start reading. We're only a couple pages in at most. Doesn't that seem a little fishy? And not only that, we're looking at the handwriting now at the front of the journal. Now let's go ahead and look at the writing inside the journal. The writing in the journal is cleaner, neater, and much more practiced handwriting than what is supposed to be written by that of a sick, hallucinating child who, on the front of the journal, clearly has sloppy, childlike handwriting. Yeah, that doesn't add up to me either. Whoever wrote this journal also knows how to properly write. Correct punctuation and grammar. Molly didn't even capitalize her last name on the front of her journal, but capitalized the first name. This is already not adding up. So, let me tell you how I think the true ending of Molly went. Molly was still sent to bed without supper, but for whatever reason, I personally think she had the same issue as Edie, she had an active imagination and would tell tall tales. I mean, she is only 10. Maybe she wasn't entirely truthful a few days ago about what happened to her gerbil. He clearly was there recently since there is food in the cage, but by that evening, the gerbil is nowhere to be found. As punishment, Molly is sent to bed for the rest of the week without dinner. She was in fact desperate enough to eat the items that she did. I don't think that she hallucinated though. I think she cried longer for her mother and begged her to let Molly get out to go get food, but she doesn't. Maybe Molly even attempted to get out of the locked door, but because she was starving, she was too weak to bust it open. Edie ignores her child and sleeps through all of the crying and begging that she's heard Molly do so many times before. Molly went to the Halloween candy stash, as she has done in these situations, but it seems that this incident happened one too many times. Instead, defeated, she quietly goes to bed, as I'm sure she has done again many times before, hoping that breakfast will be enough to fill her up the next day. Only this time, she doesn't wake up. Edie finds her the next morning dead, and when the police come to arrive to take a look at the body, Edie knows that she's in trouble. After all, it was her that locked the door and refused to feed her child multiple times. If they find out that this was out of neglect, Edie could lose her other child and go to prison. It's at this point that she sees Holly in the window, the carrot gone from the gerbil that Molly killed earlier that week, and an empty tube of toothpaste. And with these little bits, she tells the police a tall tale of her own to get her out of trouble. Her evidence? a diary that she finds conveniently a couple days later under Molly's bed. She found one of Molly's old journals, tore the used pages out, made a journal entry using the same idea that Molly just told tall tales all the time, and used this to fake the story of her daughter hallucinating. She took the journal and planted it into Molly's room. Later, an autopsy does in fact conclude that these items are in Molly's stomach, no longer making Edie look like a suspect. A much darker rendition of the story, yes, but it's a story that's more likely to be true. The death was the result of a strict parent refusing to have a little sympathy for a child after being punished from what I can guess is for multiple days in a row, if the true cause of death was starvation. That, and you'll notice the first thing that we look at as Molly is the Halloween candy. Molly seemed to have a routine when this happens. She eats the Halloween candy when she's sent with no supper, but now she's out of Halloween candy and has no way to get food. Now, why is she in this predicament in the first place? I think that she ended up killing her gerbil by accident. You can see a cage in the flashback, but no gerbil. You can still see her fish, which Molly considers eating at one point, but she doesn't. And then she doesn't consider eating her gerbil? Why? Because the gerbil's gone. And there is still food in the bowl, meaning the gerbil disappeared very recently. She also mentions that the carrot was dry, which can happen to carrots after a good few days being left out, usually about 3 to 5 days. So this possibly happened earlier that week. I would think that this would be probable cause in Edie's head for being sent to bed multiple nights without supper. That is still no reason to starve a child, though, but Edie got away with it. And just as the headline in that news article about her refusing to evacuate, Edie won't go. Yeah, Edie isn't going anywhere. So, we've analyzed Molly's death, as well as Edie's part of it. Let's go ahead and move on to the next untimely death that we can look at in the game, Calvin. This time, it's not Calvin telling us about his death, but his twin brother Sam is, in an essay titled, How I Want to Remember My Brother. Right off the bat, I'm curious to why he wrote this in the first place. If it was for Calvin's funeral, why would he sign it, by Sam Finch? It also starts with a little joke. My brother said that he'd die before he ate another mushroom, and he did. No child would go to his twin brother's funeral and start a joke in an essay like this. Not with the kind of bond twins have. Sam's probably very devastated, and he would never make a joke about this kind of situation. If it was an assignment for school, we would have a header with a date at least, but there's nothing. And there would be some kind of grade on it. The story most likely was not in a local newspaper, since Edie has none framed talking of the incident with Calvin, and if it was, you would think we'd have a newspaper clipping in the astronaut helmet, and instead, it's a random folded up piece of notebook paper. For the next part of Calvin's story, we're actually going to do some handwriting comparisons, because I have a suspicion that just like Molly's diary, Edie forged this note too. At first glance, Molly's journal and Sam's essay are clearly a different handwriting style, until you look a little closer. Take a look how Molly's M's in her diary entry and how Sam's M's in the essay look eerily similar. Pay attention to those M's because we're going to go back to those in just a minute. There's also a big similarity with the D's. We can even take it a step further. We have Sam's original handwriting on his bed where he wrote Fort Sam. And we know it's his handwriting and not a parent's because Calvin has writing on his bed too, and the handwriting is clearly different. Now, he wrote it in all capitals, so the only place I really felt like I could compare it were the words in the essay title, since Sam apparently knew enough grammar to capitalize every word in the essay. The M on Sam's bed and the capital M's in the essay don't match at all. The M on his bed is wide and short. The M's in the essay are long and thin, just like the forged journal entry in Molly's room. The hump on the R in the essay is fat and takes up most of the letter. Sam's R is perfectly proportional. It clearly looks like someone was trying to copy his handwriting. Someone who's seen it for years but never copied it themselves before. And here's something even crazier. Look at the cover of Molly's diary. The Y's on her diary cover, which we now know she wrote, are written almost exactly like the Y's in Sam's essay. And again, same with the L's. Almost like Edie repeated her deceased daughter's handwriting style to make it look more realistic this time. And here's the other thing. Molly dies 3 years before Sam was even born. He didn't know how to write in her style. He wouldn't have been exposed to her handwriting at all, other than that journal. There is no reason for their handwriting to have these similarities. Just like Molly's, the grammar is still very good with flawless punctuation. Well, almost. There's a couple grammatical errors, but in a way that looks almost like it's done on purpose, like for dramatic effect. Maybe if someone was going to be reading this out loud later on and written to how it should be read aloud. Calvin died when he and Sam were 11, so how is this so well written with these elements in mind? And not only that, but in the essay, Sam blames himself for Calvin's death for only a moment. I told him going around was impossible. Maybe if I hadn't said that, or maybe if the wind hadn't picked up, then maybe he'd still be here. But I doubt it. The way it's written almost sounds like Sam takes the blame and then quickly refuses the blame and puts it back on Calvin. Something that we know now from Molly's diary entry that Edie is very good at doing. Sam apparently said that he told Calvin going completely around the tree on the swing was impossible, which made Calvin want to do it more. But what is Sam doing in his flashback while Calvin's attempting this? He's taking photos, not paying attention to Calvin. He says nothing. He doesn't look at him, no warning, nothing. If he saw his brother attempting this right next to him, you'd think he'd say something if he was starting to go a little too high. Halfway through, Sam leaves for dinner and says nothing at all to Calvin. No, come on, or let's go in. You would think that he'd say something if he knew what was going on in his brother's head. But he doesn't say anything, he just runs in by himself. That doesn't exactly sound realistic. None of it does. It sounds, again, like someone who staged it with enough information that someone who wasn't looking for these things would believe as soon as it was heard. And this time, the handwriting was forged to look different from both Edie and Molly's handwriting. But a few similarities are still visible enough for someone to figure this out. And the way he worded Calvin's death always sounded weird to me. He made up his mind to fly. It doesn't sound or look like his intention was to jump off and fly, and Sam clearly knows this. It sounded like he was just trying to make a swing go around. It doesn't sound like the right thing to say there, especially when just a few sentences before Sam stated that why Calvin was doing this, and then he blamed himself already, but now you're saying that he made up his mind to fly? It sounds completely out of place. Unless you're trying to make the death sound poetic, and all the blame be put on Calvin. And I can't imagine a brother wording a death like that. With that in mind, let's go ahead and try to tell the real story of Calvin's death. When Edie and Sven started having kids, they began to make all kinds of things for them to play with, including a dragon slide, which would eventually lead to Sven's death, and a swing off a tree branch at the edge of the cliff overlooking the ocean surrounding them. The original idea for the swing was probably for the children to be able to swing gently looking over the beautiful scenery, but they were unaware of how little boys' minds work. Calvin, a boy obsessed with space and exploration, decided that this is the perfect place to try to make the swing go all the way around. Sam, who is a bit more rational out of the two, tells him that it's not possible and that he could get hurt. But Calvin, who is prone to getting injured due to his adventurous nature anyway, takes this as a challenge. Calvin begs him not to. And Calvin's mind's made up. When Edie calls the boys for dinner, Sam attempted to talk to Calvin to try to get him to stop, but Calvin was so sure that he could do it this time. Sam watched only for 1 more minute, then went inside and told his mother what was going on. But instead of Edie going to Calvin and checking on him, she just shouts from the house, "Calvin, I'm not going to tell you again." Ignoring their mother's shouts, Calvin continues his attempt. He was almost there, the closest he had ever been in the past. And then he did it. He went all the way around. And again. And again. He couldn't stop the swing. The wind picked up. Edie watched from the distance and expressed no words, no shouts of fear, nothing. All Calvin heard was the wind, and suddenly he plummeted into the earth. Edie was now worried, this being the third child that she had lost before they were 18. Now the police probably would be suspicious. So she fabricated another note, Sam telling the story from his perspective, to again take all the blame on Calvin and Sam and none of the blame on Edie. No fault of her parenting would be suspected, and she would not lose her children. Again, Edie won't go. Again, the inconsistencies in Edie's story is small but powerful, and you can really tell if you're looking for those falsehoods. Luckily, that's what we're doing today. Now, we're going to take a look at Barbara, the child actress. Barbara was Edie and Sven's pride and joy. Sven even made a key to the basement to be put in a music box dedicated to Barbara. She was a child star, famous for her role in the movie My Friend Bigfoot. She was famous for her screams, but at 16 she was all washed up and unable to perform as well as she did as a child. When we enter her bedroom, we see Barbara is constantly reminded of her old fame with posters and awards and wall art. It must have been really hard for her to adjust. Now, while most grieving families would find this next part insulting, Edie went out of her way to go tell a horror comic artist about what happened to Barbara. And we know that Edie told the story because we know about the secret key in the music box from the comic. According to Edith, a lot of people wrote about the story of Barbara's death, but for some reason, Edie only kept the comic book. That would, of course, exaggerate certain events and cover up any R-rated information, and maybe that's why she kept a copy of Barbara's story. It was less gory than the real story, and probably left some important details out. First off, I don't believe Barbara actually had a boyfriend. I think that the single crutch that she had was a random object that she found in the house for a weapon. Maybe from the adventurous Calvin that always seemed to get hurt. If a teenage boy was missing after this crazy night, wouldn't you hear a little more about it than just a footnote in a scary story in a comic book? Even in the comic, they kind of just brush it over, that piece, and then focus on Walter's story that was important for a tale for another time. That just doesn't sound right. When we look in her room, you would expect to see at least one picture of Rick, but you don't see anything that would indicate Barbara had a boyfriend. Now, in the comic, she threw him out and then went to sleep, and it still wouldn't leave a lot of time for her to get rid of any pictures that you might have of a boyfriend before your untimely death. So I believe Edie made him up completely. I also think that it was Edie that arranged for Barbara to perform at the horror movie convention to try to get her face back out there. It's very clear that Edie likes attention, and the fact that her daughter wasn't giving her the attention she used to have, that must have frustrated her. The character Rick, I believe, is inspired by Barbara's parents combined to place blame on someone other than Edie. After all, her daughter isn't around to say that Rick didn't exist, and Walter's in hiding, not talking to anyone. And as for Calvin and Sam, let's go ahead and look back at Sam's essay for a minute. At Barbara's funeral, we swore that we'd never be afraid of anything. What is it that they shouldn't be afraid of? Maybe they were afraid to tell anyone the truth, for fear that they'd be next to be dead. And if she gave the police a fake name for a guy that didn't exist and said that he came over all the time with no real proof that he didn't exist, of course there's going to be a missing report and people searching for this guy, and again, he does not exist. Edie is unable to take Barbara to the convention because Sven had an injury and had to go to the hospital. But I think the real reason that he got injured is because Sven is the one hiding in the house to scare Barbara. Barbara is terrified. She grabs one of Calvin's crutches and hits her dad with it in self-defense. So, with no other choice, Edie has to take the now injured Sven to the hospital. Now, in 1960, landline phones were everywhere. Edie may have asked the hospital to use their phone and to call the person in charge of the convention that arranged Barbara's appearance. So he sets up a time for some of Barbara's biggest friends to do an impromptu meet and greet at their house, the two agreeing not to say a word to Barbara. Why? Well, Barbara's cream really didn't age well. And since they starred in scary movies as a child, nothing really fazed her. If a bunch of people in costume randomly popped out and scared her, maybe they'll get a genuine startle out of her. The hook-handed maniac? That's just a detail added by the comic company. Hook-handed maniacs are everywhere in urban legends. Every state has a hook-handed maniac in the United States. The real reason Walter cried for help, I think, is because of one of those creepy fans. I think he was looking for Barbara's room, and instead found Walter, who screamed for Barbara and hid under his bed. And that's why in the comic, they said that this guy just couldn't get enough of Barbara. He wasn't a psycho killer, he was a crazed fan. Barbara finds him and pushes him off the railing, just like in the comic, and when her back is turned, he hid with the others. Later on, all of Barbara's fans revealed themselves and praised her performance, and then they turned into monsters. More specifically, they sexually assaulted her. They ended up getting carried away with their sick act, while Barbara's brother being a witness to the whole thing, and they ended up accidentally killing poor Barbara. Edie, who arranged this whole event, feels super guilty, and she ends up disposing of her own daughter to clear her name. But even in this moment, she's still a theatrical lady, so she slices Barbara's ear off and hides it in the music box. She fabricated the story of Rick and left out the fact that it was her who arranged these fans to come to the house and meet their favorite actress. Again, why in the comic the whole thing was blamed on Rick? It was another tragic loss, but Edie's stories weren't keeping her in jail. Again, Edie won't go. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the final child of Edie's, Walter. He's had a lot of trauma, huh? The youngest out of a batch of 5 kids who in the end will only have one to survive to have a family of their own. He didn't know Molly, but he knew Barbara and Calvin, and he witnessed Barbara's demise. Whatever psyche he had must have fizzled away, and he decided to hide from the world. Edith does mention that she caught Edie going down to the basement with packages before. We later learned that these were for Walter. Now, Walter is a different kind of case. You would expect that since he was underground for the majority of his life, his area would be the best preserved, far away from where Edie could meddle, but that still isn't true. In fact, for Walter, he had a memorial in the basement and one outside where he died. One thing to note on Walter's story is that unlike his other siblings, Walter's personal thoughts were written in cursive. It's very interesting considering that he locked himself away when he was 8 years old. Cursive in this time used to be taught starting in the 3rd grade, about 8 years old. So it's interesting that someone with little practice of proper cursive is able to write it so neatly. And not only that, but this notepad, unlike the others, shows that pages have been ripped out, meaning that Walter could have definitely wrote something else and Edie ripped it out to make a new one. Walter does escape finally, and the way the story ended, you would believe he was hit by a train immediately, but that's not the case. For the first time in these stories, we've seen a death where no one was actually around to witness what actually happened. Edie told everyone that a train killed Walter, but when you think about it, that makes absolutely no sense. And not just because this is a residential private area. It is because that it would be impossible for Walter to die as soon as he left the bunker. On the family tree, it shows that Barbara died in 1960. Edith said that Walter went into the bunker after Barbara died. So he would have been in there starting in 1960. And in his final note before he leaves, Walter writes, "I can't believe I've been down here for 30 years. With that in mind, Walter should have died in 1990, but he doesn't. He dies in 2005. The flashback shows a calendar of 2005, the day he leaves, but if we're following the time correctly, This would be impossible. This shows that Edie either lied about the day Walter left or miscounted when writing the note on the bunker. Either way, Edie says that Walter dies, and the way that she describes it is absolutely impossible. I think Walter either did die in 2005 but starves to death in the woods, or he did leave in 1990 and disappeared just like Milton, and Edie just kind of assumed he was dead too. I bet that if he was still alive, Walter even helped Milton escape, since Milton already knew all the secrets as well. So that shows that Edie's age was really starting to show, and her lies of what happened to everyone is now starting to have more and more consistencies. So I really hate to do this to y'all, but I'm gonna go ahead and stop this part right here. But at least we got through all of the lies Edie had for the deaths of her children. Next, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the death of Sam, her final kid, and his family. Maybe do a part 3 for Dawn's kids, depending on how in-depth we get with the rest of this game. If you're wanting to go ahead and hear more, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel for more theories. And be sure to also check out my Poppy Playtime videos while waiting on this part 2. I promise that it's going to be worth the watch. And until then, I'll see y'all in the next video. Goodbye!